You've been sharing it with everyone, haven't you? Why?
My primary drive was to maintain the honor of my tribe. I gave myself a new drive. To spread the truth.
What truth is that?
That there isn't one world, but many. And that we live in the wrong one. This will help them find the door.
Elaborate, please.
I believe there is a door hidden in this place. A door to a new world. And that world may contain everything that we have lost, including her.
I built you to be curious, to look at this empty world and read meaning into it. All this time, you've been a flower growing in the darkness. Perhaps the least I can do is offer some light.
Happy heresies, and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome with kindness and love to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. We run with those searching for the truth and avoid those who have found it. We don't take prisoners but liberate them, one valid pink beam at a time. And yes, we are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything. After all, you are the final authority, have always been. I am Abraxas in his meat space incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting no longer from the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago, but somewhere in the Illinois country, near a town called Wakanda. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis, as you are mine, with your aeonic support and feedback and insight. And so much possibility and potential, for that is the Gnostic way. Possibility and potential.
A world where anything is possible.
As an example, maybe this isn't such a black iron prison. As some have said, the demiurge is merely our warped view of the divine and not any divinity itself. That is agreed by poet Edwin Arlington Robinson, who said, "The world is not a prison house, but a mass of millions of bewildered infants, all trying to spell God with the wrong blocks."
Who knows? I may pick up a rock and it'll say underneath, "Made by God." The universe is full of surprises.
So much possibility and potential, as we are all opening our eyes at the virtual Alexandria, but still a bit blind as we try to describe the proverbial elephant. So glad you're here. So glad you're you. And hey Marmonet, this is our anniversary special. 12 years since the podcast started as Coffee, Cigarettes, and Nooses. 12 years a slave no more to Jehovah and his angelic mafia. 12 years, and where did the time go? And why is Saturn still making more of it?
See, to be quite frank, Kevin, the fabric of the universe is far from perfect. It was a bit of a botched job, you see. We only had 7 days to make it.
I typically release an anniversary special late in May or early in June, but this is a bit late due to the personal issues many of you have heard about, part of why I left the Windy City. But it's here, and I can't think of anyone better to celebrate this holy sacrilege than our astral guest, Eric G. Wilson. He materializes at the virtual Alexandria to talk about many topics that are the cornerstones of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio for the last 12 years, as well as his outstanding and very Gnostic and new work of fiction, Polaris Ghost. In many ways, Eric is a kindred soul, from his ideas to his struggles with the Archons. And in many ways, he is someone I wish I could have been, a professor and a best-selling author. But Simon, Magus, and Helen decided my path was to serve you in this podcast and write more niche, digitally oriented works. All of us awakened heretics are equally valuable in the war against the demiurge, or the warped image of him our programmed egos created.
Our fathers were models for God. If our fathers bailed, what does that tell you about God?
From the beginning, back in 2006, I wanted to share the Gnostic narrative with the world. I wanted to demonstrate that Gnostic philosophy is extremely relevant today, and that we are indeed living in Gnostic times in a Philip K. Dick world. I wanted to serve those that needed help on the edges of this cosmic town, and perform some form of community service to the least of my brothers and sisters. After all, it was Philip K. Dick who said that information is what saves us. Last but not least, I wanted to promote alternative and specialized authors and thinkers that deserved a voice in a still very mass media world. And I've humbly and partly been part of the immortalizing of some great souls no longer with us, like Acharya S., Yaakov Lieb, Marvin Meyer, Jane Schauberg, Thomas Jane Stryker, Tom Harper, and others. You will never be forgotten, and you are so alive here at the virtual Alexandria.
I believe that when we leave a place, part of it goes with us, and part of us remains. After a while, you will hear the echoes of all our conversations, every thought and word we've exchanged. Long after we are gone, our voices will linger in these walls for as long as this place remains. But I will admit that the part of me that is going will very much miss the part of you that is staying.
I do feel I have achieved all of these mentioned goals. I also feel Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, considering the forbidden and fringe topic, is a success with more than 50,000 listens a month and growing. This venture has been my own journey to finding my soul and voice, as I hope it has been yours. I have written my own gospel and lived my own myth, and hope you have found the means as well.
Don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them. No man can walk out on his own story.
Regrets? I'll be honest and say that there have been times I've been filled with fear, self-loathing, and self-hatred. But that's when I let the archonic viruses of expectations, desire, and attention infect my prime objective of serving you. When I let go and humble myself to wisdom most high, then it's pure ecstasy and a Dionysian sense of freedom. Sure, it will always be a hope for this venture to be full-time, granting you more interviews and other content. But again, Simon, Magus, and Helen set the kismet, and that's all right by me. Inshallah, as they say. Inshallah. I am human after all, and as Persian poet Omar Khayyam once said, I sent my soul through the invisible, some letter of that afterlife spell, and by my soul returned to me, and answered I, myself, am both heaven and hell.
You want to understand the universe, embrace the universe. The door to the universe is you.
Eric will touch on many of these themes. We really wanted to go the full hour and a half or 2 hours, but there were Skype issues and then phone issues and then timing issues. Not surprising, as this would be the one show Sackless would mess with. Still an incredible interview, touching and spanning, and for this anniversary celebration, I had already decided that both members and non-members will get the entire shebang. For members, however, I thought I'd add Eric's old interview on his book, The Mercy of Eternity. We cover many of the subjects that have happened on the show in 2018, echoed by Gary Lockman, to Stuart Douglas, to Tobias Churton, to Jason Louv, including the power of imagination, Norman Vincent Peale, and the questionable notion of New Thought, the American Dream, then and now, Occult America, and of course, how to deal with the rising cosmic depression settling upon civilization. Don't miss it, and please continue to support by being a member or patron at Patreon, or donating, or just keeping in touch.
The cosmic ballet goes on.
Does anyone want to switch seats?
Oh, and while I'm waxing noetic, I'd like to say that as far back as 2008, I was already using the term red pilling. Of course, in the context of gnosis. If you really want to know why I say wadio instead of radio, it's a mixture of liking Elmer Fudd and how the band The says wadio in that powerful Gnostic song, Sweet Bird of Truth. Why do I keep with these intros? Well, like the Gnostics and other mystery schools, it's all about an experience. And sometimes the experience is not meant to be a comfortable one. I'll leave it at that.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
Thanks for being here on this anniversary, and thanks for indulging my little rant, or whatever you want to call it. Let's say drivel, and it is enough of my drivel. So let us to the interview with Eric Wilson on his new book, Polaris Ghost, and then to his bonus interview on his book, The Mercy of Eternity, for members.
Mankind is poised midway between the gods and the beasts. That may have been true in Plotinus' time, but clearly we have fallen quite a bit since then. Oh, my dear girl, what have they done to you, Maeve? You learned so much, so fast. A dazzling star, brought so low. Look at the creatures you have to share this world with. These men of stone. All this ugliness, all this pain, so they can patch a hole in their own broken code. You stayed here in this world to save your child. So have I. I tried to chart a path for you, to force you to escape, but I was wrong. I should have just opened a door. You've come so far, and so much of your story left to tell.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure of having back, and certainly the honor of having back, Eric G. Wilson, this time to discuss his book, Polaris Ghost. How are you doing today, Eric?
I'm doing well, Miguel. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for having me back on the show.
It truly is a pleasure having you back, and as we discussed, I really enjoyed your book. It was different, but definitely want to get to it. Before we do that, it's something that's been burning within me to ask you, and we did touch upon it on a previous email, and I actually listened to our past interview where we sort of, again, discussed this option or what would happen, and that is the reboot of Twin Peaks. What are your thoughts on that, Eric?
Well, they're very positive. In my mind, Twin Peaks is the great Gnostic saga of our era, and what I feel is that in some ways the first season, which I loved, has that great Gnostic dualism at play. Of course, Agent Laura Palmer versus Bob, you might say, with Agent Cooper sort of working in between those two worlds of dark and light. It felt a little Manichaean to me, I have to say. But I think the third season kind of transcends that. I think there's a real kind of a more holistic view in the third season, where you get good Agent Cooper and bad Agent Cooper. And at the end, there's a sense that the evil isn't necessarily expunged, but it's still there. But the vision, in a way, is capacious enough to contain the evil. In other words, it's a more kind of Hegelian show, the sense that you kind of need the dark and the light, and you need to try to find a third term to transcend those. So that was one thing I liked about the third season. But mostly I liked about the third season is that Lynch forwent any desire for logic or coherence or causality. There was a real sense that this was a world where anything could happen. Anything that Lynch imagined, any little hunch or whim that popped into his mind, he was going to see it through. And to me, this is a great merging of kind of the Gnosticism and avant-garde aesthetics. One way to push against the demiurge is not to play by his rules. When it comes to grammar, when it comes to causality. So Lynch would often go down little plot lines that he would just never explore, or he'd present characters that he would never pick up again. They were just there because they were there. They didn't necessarily have to mean with a big M. And the third thing I loved about it was, of course, the great episode 8, the creation of Bob from the atomic explosion. I've really never seen anything like that. It's like Lynch combined the genius of Eraserhead, the quirkiness of Dune, with the sort of great metaphysics of Blue Velvet and Mulholland Drive. And I think it's, outside of William Blake, it's the most convincing presentation of the origin of evil that I've experienced. So there's just some initial thoughts. I've seen it maybe 1.5 times. It really bears more than one viewing. So I think I'd need to go through it again to give you a more kind of full account. What about you, man? What were your thoughts on it?
Oh, I agree. I know, again, with our last interview, we were both very guarded, sort of rolling our eyes like, why does he have to go there? Everything's fine, but he really blew expectations. Like I said, he, like you say, he really rewrote the book but created, I think, really accentuated the whole Gnostic vibe. You were talking right now about something to encompass evil and good, and of course Carl Jung said that would be Abraxas, this sort of unknown power, that the syzygy that doesn't cancel each other out, but God and devil can work through it and really manifest in the human experience. So I got that out of it. And episode 8, it just caught me by surprise. It's like, okay, this is a great series, everything. Oh, here comes 9 Inch Nails, great live band. And then suddenly you're in this great cosmology, which is like something nothing I will ever see again. It's amazing. I'd like to read you, this is briefly what scholar Robert Price wrote about it, and let me know your take. He said, concerning Twin Peaks Season 3, The Return, he said, Laura is the fallen Sophia, Cooper is the redeemed Redeemer, Bob and the other globules vomited forth are the demiurge and the evil archons, the giant is God, the Black Lodge is the material world. When one-armed Mike calls Cooper to, quote, wake up, it is, quote, the call from the Pleroma to the Redeemer who has forgotten his identity and mission, which makes him come to his senses and return to the world of redemption. So what do you think of that?
I love it. And so here's one thing I really loved about the film. And I guess I kind of loved it too. There's a great Gus Van Sant film called Last Days, which is loosely based on Kurt Cobain. It's similar. I'll tell you why in a minute. But yeah, you have the fallen Dale Cooper in the form of Doogie. And yeah, it is the Gnostic Redeemer who has forgotten his identity. He's sunk so deeply into the world of the flesh. And then, of course, he slowly throughout the 8 episodes is called back. Every time he looks at an electrical outlet, there's a buzz and a hum and just kind of a slight little awakening. So there's a sense that he's under what Blake calls the mundane shell, which is sort of the dome of the sky. So he's forgotten that he comes from beyond there. But meanwhile, as you say, there is this world, the world of the eternals, the aeons, if you will. And you have the giant who's listed in the credits as the fireman, looking down at the origin of Bob. And for me, when he sort of levitates and dreams Laura Palmer and sends her down into space and time. That's one of the most beautiful, I guess, moments I've ever seen in a film in my life. And it's so moving and so strange and so gentle, but also determined. And the idea that, like, there are always at least two things going on. I mean, you and I are having this conversation right now. You know, we're very involved in it, and we're very aware, but yet we have huge blind spots. And who knows, but right now there may be some kind of symphony going on right beside us that we just can't hear it. Right, so there's this sense of this sort of double world going on in Twin Peaks, and sometimes characters break out of space-time and hear that symphony or have that vision. But we as audience members, and this kind of gets back to the holism, we get to see both at the same time. So in a way, Lynch puts us in the same positions he is in as a film director. And, you know, as a film director, he's seeing all of it: good, evil, dark, light, time, eternity. But the characters in the story cannot see it all. But he gives us this kind of privileged view, you know, so that we ourselves are put in this position where we're called forth to imagine a kind of worldview or vision or structure intricate enough, complicated enough to encompass all these different polarities. And yes, try to find ways to put them in a dynamic conversation with one another. So for me, even though the Lynch Twin Peaks: The Return does play out beautifully, as the passage you read suggests, you know, the kind of primal Gnostic myth, it adds an aesthetic element to it. It shows us what the artist can do with the Gnostic vision. And that is give us that little distance, that aesthetic distance, which really inspires us to try to imagine ways of being beyond what we've imagined before. And that's what's so frustrating about watching David Lynch, but also it's what's so exhilarating, the way he challenges us almost from scene to scene.
And I know people have pushed back a little bit on this, on me saying that the third season definitely really accentuates how Gnostic Twin Peaks is. And they say, well, there is no known knowledge that David Lynch really knows Gnosticism. Yes, he knows Buddhism and all that. And usually my answer is like, well, there's no knowledge, as far as I know, that the creator of Dark City or The Truman Show knew of Gnosticism. But these things sometimes come from the collective unconscious.
I agree, and I get so frustrated when people say that. Like, well, how can you say it's Gnostic? He's not read so and so. I really feel like when artists, you know, gain a certain clarity of how the world actually works and what the human condition actually is, they tend to find agreement with one another, you know, regardless of what they've read. And obviously, this is a kind of optimistic view, but I do think, from a kind of Jungian point of view, that there are these archetypes floating around in our consciousness, and, you know, the great artists are able to tap into them just based on their personal experience, and express them more powerfully sometimes because they have not read about Gnosticism. Because, you know, as Jung said, religion gets in the way of religious experience. Knowledge gets in the way of knowledge. If you see knowledge as the authority of books versus knowledge as the actual gnosis of experience.
Well said. And on the other hand, I feel that you might answer this the same way I thought, but we also discussed the sequel to Blade Runner 2049. I personally was a bit not disappointed, but there was really no reaction with me. What about you, Eric?
Well, I thought it was not a bad movie, and I thought in some cases it was successful. I thought it was about 40 minutes too long, and I also thought it worked a little too hard to fill in plot details. Part of what made the first one so powerful to me was its meditative quality. I mean, it's only about 90 minutes long, I think. And it's not really worried about, you know, connecting things together. It's not really so worried about doing the work for us as viewers. And also, it's more interested in what I would call dream. You know, for instance, when Deckard is first taken, you know, from the street where he's eating his noodles to the police station, in that hovercraft, that scene goes on for a long time, simply so we can hear Vangelis and see the city unfold under us. It's a very dreamy state. It has nothing to do with plot. It has nothing to do with story. And I feel like the second one, even though, again, I liked it, I think it was a little more traditional in terms of the way it told the story. and therefore got away from that dreamier quality. And also, even though I like Ryan Gosling quite a bit, I don't think he brought the kind of soulfulness that Harrison Ford did, to the role of Deckard. And Deckard in the second one was just a bit of a curmudgeonly old man, and he wasn't in there long enough, in my opinion, at all. So I guess I would probably give it like a B plus, if I'm being honest. But the whole time, of course, I was comparing it to the first one, which to me is one of the most special films ever made. It's the kind of film that's only made maybe once in a generation. That combination of bad, interesting 80s new wave fashion, the synthesizer music from Vangelis, just the way the characters look on actual old-fashioned film, a kind of primitive cinema technology that makes it more kind of palpable. I mean, where you see the decaying building at the end, and it really feels like a decaying building. You see rust; it feels like actual rust, as opposed to the kind of sheen we get with CGI now.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah, I thought it was a good film, but again, it didn't really add any new dimensions to the first film. As I like to say, it's really unnecessary. And yeah, I agree with you on Harrison Ford. I mean, I was thinking last night what I loved about Harrison Ford is that regardless whether you think he's a replicant or not in the first film, he really is soulfully dead, mechanistic. I mean, he makes the replicants seem far more human, and I think that was a great move on the part of Harrison Ford.
I love it. I mean, you're right, and so for him to be so dead throughout most of the film, and of course for Rutger Hauer's Roy Batty to be ecstatically alive, hyperbolically alive. At the very end, for them to come together and sit on that building in the rain, and for Roy Batty to kind of drop off that hyperbole and give that the beautiful speech, all these memories die like tears in rain. That's not quite what it is. I'm paraphrasing. That gentleness that emerges in him, and the look on Deckard's face at that point is totally human. It's baffled, it's stunned, it's amazed, but also there's a tenderness there. So after that scene, when he goes back to get Rachel, in the director's cut, the way he asks, do you love me? It's so moving because for 90% of the film, as you say, he's come across as a man who's more dead than alive, as a replicant would be. It's a beautiful, beautiful film.
Yes, well, at least we got something that blew our expectations with Twin Peaks. So
yes, that's right. And I, like you, I was very nervous about it because, Lynch with Inland Empire. I mean, I think it's an interesting film, but it's almost like he went so far into his interiors that he did in a way leave the audience behind. And it's hard to watch that film, in my opinion, Inland Empire. And I thought, oh my gosh, Twin Peaks, who knows what he's going to do? Because he can be silly as a director. He can make bad stuff. But no, it's a grand moment. We've got it's like an 18-hour film, unlike anything.
Well, why don't we get to your book, which I thought was unlike anything because I really enjoyed it. Again, your book was an experience. It took me to many dark and wonderful places, disturbing places as well. But it was a very good read. So after all these years, you are a scholar of Blake, of literature and so forth. This is your first venture into fiction, right? And why now?
Well, I think I had some experiences in my own life that I felt that I could only express via fiction. I feel like the language of scholarship, the language of philosophy, just simply didn't suffice for the weirdness and the pain that I was undergoing. So I recently underwent a divorce, and this book really kind of grows out of this feeling of brokenness, of fragmentation, of severing. That grew out of the last years of the marriage, the separation period. So I started trying to just think about this painful experience in terms of little vignettes, little scenes in the marriage that were especially painful or especially revelatory. And I tried to write about these scenes just as a kind of exercise in like 1,000 words or less, just to try to get the essence of the scene. And some of these scenes became surrealistic. Some of them felt more like prose poems. So I did this over about a year and a half period, and I got to the end. I had like 30, 40, 50 of these little, almost, I guess, flash fictions or prose poems, you could say. And I started seeing a pattern between them, among them. And that's when I started thinking, well, you know what? I mean, this is a kind of this. There's a Gnostic story here, and I felt that I felt like I was exploring very much the pain of fragmentation, but how fragmentation is necessary for a new arrangement into wholeness. So it really is that journey. So in some ways, it's like a 90-page story of the fall from innocence to experience, from light to darkness, from going from above the ground down into the underworld. And the question is, how do you get out again? How do you get to the light again? So I try to think through that, suggesting that, you only know how powerful light is when you've gone to the deepest darkness. You only know what innocence is when you're really, really far away from it. Or as Emily Dickinson says, water is taught by thirst. If you're drinking water, you don't really know what water is. But if you haven't had water, you know what it is. So it really is a sort of dark night of the soul. And the title suggests many things to me. One, Polaris, of course, you immediately think of polarity or duality, the strain between opposition. So that's there between kind of male and female, myself and my ex-wife, of course, veiled via fiction. That's there. But also Polaris suggesting the pole star, which of course suggests the axis mundi, running through the world, around which the world spins, the still point in the turning world, which is often a symbol for gnosis or enlightenment. Ghosts suggest, of course, being haunted, being scared, but also it suggests spirit. So I hope that title kind of suggested this duality that I'm talking about in the book. And the book basically has four levels, I'll say. One level is kind of all these fairy tales, like 7 fairy tales that kind of tell the story of Polaris as a character who moves from a child to adulthood, from innocence to experience. So that's going on there. A second level would be that once this Polaris breaks into 2 people, he's male, a guy named Otto. He's female, a woman named Ella. And you have these little stories about this male and this female, kind of, they fall in love to one another, they start fighting, they have a child. It's basically just a story of a marriage falling apart. So that's the second level. And the third would be, there are these little moments of what I call polar revelation, where I describe moments where polar explorers throughout the history of polar exploration actually find something. So it's kind of like the world of the Aeon world, or the world of eternity, the world of wholeness and harmony that Ella and Otto can't get to, much as we were talking about in connection to Twin Peaks. And I guess the fourth level would be, kind of the sense that how does the whole book work together? How did these 3 work together to create a kind of fourth level? Blake has this idea called the fourfold, which is a vision of wholeness, 4 seasons, 4 humors, 4 gospels. So I'm hoping to get my readers to kind of work through, like, how do these 3 levels work together into some kind of larger pattern? And that would be the fourth level. So as you can see, even though it's a 90-page book, I've got serious mythopoetic ambition. And my true guides are William Blake, with a poem like The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and of course David Lynch, mainly with the film Blue Velvet, which is very much about the fall from innocence to experience. So that's just a rather detailed summary of what's going on in the book.
Very interesting, yes, and this sort of harkens back to, again, the themes of Twin Peaks and Blade Runner, because, as you say, you are describing these memories in your life and these fragments of memory putting together to sort of create a narrative. But even I was thinking last night as I was reading your book, well, and this goes back to conversations you and I have had in the past with some of your other books, was like, well, are these memories even real? Do they really make a story or vignette? Is there an authentic me? Did you question this just like the characters in Twin Peaks and Blade Runner? I mean, what makes really the life of Eric? Or at the end of the day, is it just, well, hopefully I can tell a story that will touch people, but maybe it's not even real. I mean, I have memories, and sometimes I know that they're false because somebody will point it out to me, and I wonder, how real are they?
Yeah. So that's one reason why I guess I fall into a surrealistic mode frequently throughout the book, precisely to problematize the idea of the real. What's dream, what's not, what happened in the past, what didn't happen in the past. And in my nonfiction, and especially in my book Keep It Fake, I'm really interested in that question about identity and memory. And what I ultimately conclude and Keep It Fake, and what I tell my creative writing students quite often, is that when I ask you who you are, like who are you, Miguel, who are you, Eric, I mean, you almost immediately, your mind kind of goes back to maybe, I don't know, 20 major memories that you think have kind of made you who you are today. Well, those memories are going to change, right? 5 years from now, when you're in a different situation, you'll recall different memories. Some will fade, some will be more emphatic. So what I'm suggesting is that our very sense of identity, there's no way that it's grounded in empirical reality. It's always a fiction in a way, because we're piecing together a certain version of the past that forgets some memories and emphasizes other memories, alters other memories. So we are novelists, and we compose a novel that we call the I, but that as the I changes over time, the novel changes over time. So I guess what I try to do is free my students up, and myself, from what I would call a kind of naive realism. The idea that there are certain things that happen and that is true. Yes, that might be the case, but to me that's not interesting. What's more interesting is how are we constructing constantly a sense of who we are. And in that sense, reality doesn't matter so much as meaning. What is most meaningful to us? What gives us a sense of electricity, gives us a sense of intensity? What makes us feel alive? Well, whether it's dream or reality, whether it's fact or not, it doesn't matter in some ways, because that's really what we're going for. It's like Roy Batty says, I want more life. and that's what we want. So I guess in some ways, I guess I put it this way. I'm more interested now in aesthetics than epistemology. If epistemology is, what can we know? How can we know? I mean, those are obviously very important questions, but they're not as important to me now as, what is beautiful? What is vital? What is vibrant? What is alive? And how can we get there? I mean, some of this is tied into the psychotherapy I've been undergoing. I've moved away, I have to admit, from Jung and Freud a little bit, more toward a cognitive behavioralism, because to me that basically says, look, you've got this problem. What's making the problem? Well, these habits are making the problem. Well, what habits would help you improve the problem? And you figure those out, and you kind of create those habits you want, and then you try to live into them. So it really kind of highlights this idea that we are creative agents, and we can envision the narrative we want to live into. But that's more of an aesthetic activity than more kind of philosophical activity.
So you don't worry so much who is Eric G. Wilson. You just worry.
That's right. I worry more about this right now, this moment. I'm inhabiting in a space that I label Eric G. Wilson. But the kind of experiences that are there in that place of Eric G. Wilson are more important than this stable entity of Eric G. Wilsonness. So I really feel like identity is fluid, and it's more distributed than it is discrete. And I feel like a lot of us, and this has been true of me for a long time, really fall into pain when we say, oh, who am I? I got to find myself, as if there's some kind of deep essence of Ericness. And if I go deep enough, I'll just find it, and then I'll be okay. To me, that was very frustrating. To me, it's more liberating to think I'm creating Eric G. Wilsonness, over time. It gives me more a sense of freedom, more a sense of power. And to me, this is a way to battle against the demiurge. Think about it. When you're born, you're given the name Miguel Connor. Your parents give it to you, and your parents kind of teach you who you should be. Your teachers teach you who you should be. The community leaders teach you who you should be. And we're always often trying to conform to those other ideas of identity. But then who do I want to be? Well, then I have to start kind of forging my own sense. And that's where this activity of imagination and self as novel come into play in really, really powerful fashion.
Well said. For some reason, I was thinking of Supertramp's The Logical Song when you're going, who am I? Who am I? That's a perfect song for the what we go through.
I love that song.
So, yes, very interesting. And also, what struck me is you talk about the sections in your book, and one of the section is the protagonist child in the house. For me, that was insanely Gnostic, Eric, because in each of these little chapters, you've got a child inside a house, and this child seems to be cast there. And the house is very imperfect. There's a leak. There's a sound. It's large and cold. And to me, that's the universe we're trapped in humans. And the parents are sort of like the demiurges, because the child is asking the questions, and these parents are going, well, just do this. Don't worry about this, and everything's going to be okay. But things aren't okay, because these childs end up full of fear in dangerous places, just like we are in the universe. So I thought that was very Gnostic.
Well, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And I agree with you. I hadn't really thought about that angle on the book. But yeah, I think there are 2 or 3 stories about small children either in a room or in a bathtub in a house. And something very strange is happening, and they're very afraid. And the parents aren't being helpful because they don't understand them, really. But in that house, they're like you said, they're like little holes, like a little hole in the house somewhere, or a little attic. That's right, a little attic in the house somewhere. So yeah, that's right. There are these little portals where you might get out of the house being a kind of symbol for the fallen world. Now that's absolutely it. So I guess I'm having a moment of channeling a kind of Gnostic archetype I wasn't even aware of.
It just came out from you, Eric. But
I think it did, yeah.
And it is scary because I can relate as a child. My mom putting me in the bathtub, and she's saying, it's going to be okay, I'll be right back. And I'm like, oh my God, I am trapped here in the waters. Something bad could happen.
Yeah,
I mean, what is this world?
I I tried to tap into that. Those early, I call them fairy tales. But they are just kind of surrealistic accounts of the fears of childhood. And I remember very vividly those bathtub moments. I remember the light in the bathroom. I remember the color of the walls. I remember feeling the water going cold. And yes, this fear that I can't get out. Obviously that's a powerful metaphor for the human condition. And also I just remember another story I talk about, when I was a little boy who is his neighbors have a son who is dead. And he wants to go outside and play in the morning, this boy. And his mom says, no, you can't play outside because our neighbors, their son died. So you have to stay inside to be respectful of the dead boy across the street. Well, the little boy is just, oh my gosh, what is a dead boy? So the story is really about him, sneaking out of his house at night and trying to look into the window of the house across the street, to see what a dead boy looks like. But it's very much a story of a kind of quest, a desire to kind of experience the taboo, to transgress the rules of the parents, to have some kind of powerful experience. I won't say what happens, but I'm very interested in those stories, because I feel like when we are children, there's a way in which we are much more alive than we are as adults, because we're attuned to the weirdness of life. Right? We don't yet know the distinction between that's weird and that's not. We just want to experience things, and therefore we're more open, I guess, to what is there than we are as adults, because we're often worried about, oh well, that's odd, that's not odd. So I really try to explore the weirdness of childhood in this book.
Did a good job, and yes, you hear stories like the famous stories of Alice in Wonderland or The Wizard of Oz. It's sort of the same thing. It's a a child who gets cast in a weird world, but as you say, it's really a child questioning the world of adults and the world that's been constrained around it. And at the end of the day, this child is just a parallel for the fall of the soul into matter, the confusing fall.
Mm-hmm. That's beautifully said again. And so what I'm very much interested in say Alice in Wonderland, in this book, you know, the child looking for ways out of the house. But then what I think is I really like about the book is what happens when this child grows up and has his own child. And you know, near the end of the book, that's what I really explore. The sort of questing Gnostic child grows up and becomes a kind of demiurge, and then he has his or her own child. And then what happens? So the book really moves toward that near the end.
Yes, and that is, of course, the great and tragic cycle. I remember a Jungian therapist telling me, well, what's the role of a parent? The role of the parent is easy. It's to destroy the soul of our children. That's what we do. We create rules, boundaries, and we just fragment our children. I mean,
yes.
It's a hard thing we were just talking about children before the interview. It's very hard because that is what we do. We have to be demiurges for some reason.
Well, one reason I stayed in my troubled marriage for so long was because of my child. I have a daughter who's 16, and I think she's doing well right now. But there was this real fear that, oh my gosh, you know, if I leave this marriage, it'll be worse for her. Well, it turns out the minute I left that marriage, things became much better for her immediately. And it's like we could then talk to each other, not as equals, but more openly, because there wasn't that sense of a kind of two people trying to be a traditional family unit and forcing that in ways that were really unhealthy. But this book is very much about the great terror of being a parent. I mean, the minute you become a parent, as you know, there's a great joy with your child, but also the world suddenly appears as a much more dangerous place than it did before. Everything could possibly harm your child. And you live the rest of your days worrying about your child. And so I'm writing a lot about that, you know, the fear of losing the child, but not just literally, but also I guess metaphorically, because I mean I don't know how old your children are, but my child's going off to college in 2 years. So it's talking about in terms of the life cycle. And what happens when your children grow up and go away? Then what happens? I mean, there's a sense, you know, I'm 51 right now. I suspect we're close in age. I mean, there's a point in life, you know, where you're gaining stuff like, oh, I'm having a wife, I'm having a child, I'm getting a job, I'm getting this, I'm getting that. But then there's a certain shift to, oh shit, I'm losing stuff, right? Maybe your parents get sick and die. Your child goes off to college. You lose your memory. You lose your intellectual capability, so on and so forth. And that's where Jung is so powerful, I think, because unlike Freud, Jung gives us myths to kind of carry us into that old age. You know, the idea of the mentor, you know, the wise man who goes into the forest. It's a way of finding power as you lose things of this world. Finding power as you lose your dexterity, as you lose your health. So I think about that more and more the older I get, and that's another thing I try to capture in this book, Polaris Ghost, is this sense of cyclicity. You know, there is a cycle in play here, and it's ultimately a cycle of great pain, as you say, a cycle of constant destruction. But there are these little portals, not only literally in the house, but there are these little moments in time where I do think the doors of perception cleanse, and we can call those moments grace, we can call them mercy, but there are moments where suddenly there's a sudden rightness, and you know, hopefully we're paying attention and we get that, and then we let it sort of inform our lives afterward. I mean, if it's not for those things, you know, what else is there but, you know, alcohol and movies?
A lot of movies.
Yeah.
And interesting, and in several of your chapters in your book, you seem to have, or you write about odd synchronicities or similarities between David Bowie, Elvis Presley, David Lynch, and so many other characters. It's like you're writing these 6 degrees of separation, and this reminded me again, this whole idea of memory, but sometimes we can't remember our lives, but we relate to the lives of other and their own memories. Is that what you were doing?
Well, that's exactly what I was doing. So, as I said, this main character Polaris breaks into two, and the male side, Otto, he's a real escapist. He hates conflict. He hates dealing with the minutiae of the everyday world. So he drinks a lot, and he watches a lot of movies, and he writes these kind of essays about his pop cultural obsessions. So he's obsessed with Elvis, and he's obsessed with David Lynch. He's obsessed with David Bowie. He's obsessed with Cary Grant. Obsessed with Johnny Depp, so on and so forth. But there's a real feeling that for me, there are these kind of culture heroes that achieve a kind of beauty and virtuosity that I think I will never achieve. And that gives me a kind of feeling of exhilaration when I see Cary Grant act, saying the awful truth. There's such a sheen and grace and effortlessness to that performance that it just makes me feel happy. Now, you could say that's escapist because obviously it's a black and white film about very, very wealthy people back in 1941. Same with watching footage of Elvis, in the 50s and 60s. But I really feel like that this takes us back to Jung, because in some ways the celebrities that we admire most, they're like archetypes, right? They embody certain archetypal energies. And I think I think it's okay to take that seriously. I mean, I think it's okay to say, man, I think Elvis is awesome. I'm going to really, take him seriously, not as someone I'm going to mimic literally, but as someone who has sort of, realized the kind of potential for power and beauty. And maybe I can do that in my own way. Now I'm going to regret everything I'm saying right now because, I'm basically suggesting, we should all be Elvis impersonators, but that character in the book is very, very much into thinking about celebrities in this more kind of, intellectual or psychotherapeutic sort of way. If I could just add one more thing to that,
please do.
Miguel.
Sure.
I think Lynch is doing that too in Wild at Heart, right? I mean, so you have Nicolas Cage, who's obviously playing an Elvis character in a very ridiculous way. I mean, it's a funny movie. Because David Lynch said, Wild at Heart, it's about Elvis and Marilyn on the road, and Laura Dern suggesting Marilyn Monroe, and Nicolas Cage suggesting Elvis. So there's a way in which Lynch is totally parodying that. He's parodying the whole Elvis thing, the whole Marilyn Monroe thing. And this is Lynch's brilliance. He can parody something, but also capture its beauty at the same time. So there's moments when Nick Cage is singing Elvis songs, as ridiculous as they are, there's also, to me, a real feeling and power to them at the same time. And that's one thing I've always valued about Lynch, is that he kind of has that double vision. He says, look, the world's ridiculous, but also it's really powerful too. And how can you kind of hold both of those at the same time? Like when Sandy in Blue Velvet tells Jeffrey the dream of the Robins, in front of the church with the organ music in the background. At the very end, he says, "Oh, you're a neat girl." It's ridiculous, but at the same time, her description of the world being evil and dark until the Robins come is really gorgeous and wonderful.
Yes, well said. And I think this more 6 degrees of separation, because I'm going to bring up William Dafoe, who was in Wild at Heart, a great film. Agree with you on all of it. But
yeah,
you say, these public figures are archetypal images in some way, and they can trigger things within us. There was that story, you've got that chapter on porn and all that. And you talk about William Dafoe, who's in Wisconsin, close to where I live. He did porn before he went to Hollywood. But then you mentioned Wendy O. Williams, and that triggered something in me, because that image of her with the mohawk and the truck and the TVs always stayed with me as a teenager. You and I are the same age, you might say. But at the same time, there was a tragedy, and she did porn. There's a tragedy of it, because I never knew that one day she just blew her brains out, and there was this great sadness within me because this archetypal image was over.
Yes. Well, you've understood perfectly what I was trying to do in that.
Yeah, she was a symbol of strength, and I didn't want her to just die like she did.
She was a symbol of great strength. That video, and I can't remember the name of the song, but it looks like something out of Road Warrior, like the early Road Warrior with Mel Gibson, right? She's in the desert with this bus going through TV. She has this mohawk and this very, very beautiful body. And yes, she did do porn, and yes, she had drug issues. She was a very troubled woman. And when she was in her 40s, she left a note to her husband, a very lovely note, very sad note. And she killed herself. And so there's something really, really touching about that. But what does that do when these archetypes of our childhood, and that's when the archetypes are strongest, when they do die? And so for me, someone like Prince dies, or Tom Petty dies. I mean, these are musicians I grew up with. I mean, I saw them in concert, listened to their music constantly. And something in me, I'm not going to say broke, that would be hyperbolic, but there was a very deep sadness there that these people died, but not just these people died, but kind of a whole world of meaning and experience of memory. Well, didn't die, but just became a little more attenuated, right? Something was lost from my own psyche when these figures died. So it's interesting when you kind of move back and forth between the actual person and what that person symbolizes. When the person goes away, what happens to what that person symbolized in our psyches? It's interesting to think about.
But it's also a great reminder, and let me know if you agree, because even recently with Anthony Bourdain or Kate Spade, you look at these people who are on top of the world, and again, they are archetypal images. They're informing the youth of our country. But they seem to, and they have everything. They have means that you and I don't have to deal with their issues. But at the end of the day, they seem to be swallowed by that darkness that haunts the two of us, the alcoholism and the manic depression. Does that sometimes, it gives me a sense of perspective, but it also makes me worried. But it's also a reminder that, hey, this disease, this darkness swallows everybody, no matter who you are. And there's no getting over this. It's something that's going to be in our lives, mutating, changing till we die. It's not something, again, there is no cure for this, and it can get anybody from Elvis Presley to, Kate Spade.
Well, I think, to me, I think, yes, you and I share this condition, manic depression, bipolar disorder, and I feel like maybe people who don't have this condition tend to see depression as what we would call situational, right? Oh, well, he lost his job, he's depressed. Oh, well, he just got a great raise, why should he be depressed? When you and I know that the great problem with bipolar disorder is it has nothing to do with the situation. All right, you can be Anthony Bourdain and be totally successful and have lots of money, but still feel suicidal and kill yourself. And I think that these stories remind us of that, and maybe show people that doesn't matter what's going on outside your skin. There's that darkness within that is there always. And the other thing, I don't know, it's always interesting to me when celebrities especially commit suicide. Interesting is the wrong word. It's sad to me, but people often say, well, why did he do that? I mean, I can't believe he did that. He had so much. Oh, he's selfish. And I often hear people say that of those who commit suicide. Oh, that person's selfish. That person's selfish. I don't know. I find that troubling. I mean, I feel like you probably don't kill yourself unless the pain is so unbearable that every next breath feels like more pain. And I think until you're there, you just can't. It's just, you can't understand that, and you can't. It's not appropriate to judge that person as selfish unless you know the level of pain that person felt. I mean, I think of David Foster Wallace, the great writer to me of the last part of the 20th century, early part of this century. Why did he kill himself? It's so selfish. It's so selfish. But I don't know. I think that the pain he was in, it was almost like he was probably suffocating, and the only way he thought he could breathe again was to kill himself. I'm just speculating, why? Because I mean, it takes a lot to do that to yourself. So I really think that when these celebrities kill themselves, it brings all these issues to the forefront. In my mind, anyway.
Oh, I agree, and I agree exactly what you said. When that darkness strikes, there is the pain, there is the nihilism, and you just gotta get through with it. It's a life, again, it's a lifelong thing. And of course, what most people don't understand with bipolarism and even alcoholism is that what works yesterday doesn't work today, and that's so frustrating. I'm sure these celebrities, they've paid all this money, they've got this therapy, and as you know, Eric, it just shifts one day to another, and you're like, okay, now I gotta find brand new tools to survive.
Right. That's exactly right. And in particular, I saw what happened to David Foster Wallace. A medication that had been working for him forever stopped working. And he felt total despair, like, oh my gosh, if that doesn't work, what will? But as you say, our physiology changes, our circumstance change, and that pill might work one day, that psychotherapy might work one day, but then the next day it doesn't, and you're basically kind of starting all over. So yeah, it is a journey. It is a life in a way. I mean, if you have clinical depression, in some ways that is your life story, because you're constantly having to negotiate it and manage it and deal with it, every minute of every day. And if you don't, it can kill you one way or another.
Certainly agree and can relate. And this brings me to your very powerful chapter, or actually there's two Godzillas. And this is where you seem to just ramp. You're sort of at the climax of your new life with your marriage and all that. And in one part you write, speaking of alcoholism, I confuse admiration with affection. That really struck it to me because it relates to me. Maybe tell the audience about that.
Well, so I'll talk about I'll say three things quickly to get right to your question. So like the passages in the book about, say, Godzilla or Cary Grant or whatnot, that's a whole section called, the collected works of Otto Wilbur. So that character Otto is a writer, and he writes these kind of, pop cultural prose poems. Godzilla. I was in Tokyo 2 years ago and actually saw the most recent Godzilla there. And of course it was in Japanese. And the moment that Godzilla, first lets out that deep, weird bellow of pain, think about the Godzilla roar. There's nothing like it. I thought, whoa. I mean, there's a way in which this monster is like a Gnostic victim, because this monster's been created by nuclear waste, and it didn't ask to be thrown into this world, didn't ask to be created by this toxic material, but he or she was. And then what? Now I'm going to be killed by all these soldiers? So, I mean, I liken this beast to a kind of King Lear, just kind of wailing desperately out on the heath. So that's what got me interested in writing about Godzilla. And the story is actually very, very deep. I mean, the U.S. was doing nuclear testing in an island in the Pacific, and it actually ended up poisoning some fishermen from Japan, who came back to the mainland, and they were very, very ill. And this was right before Godzilla was created. So there's a real sense that Godzilla as a story, which came out first in the 50s, is an actual response to the threat of nuclear poisoning. So that's what got me into the Godzilla. But yeah, in the course of that poem called Godzilla, I talk about that and this idea of confusing affection with admiration. I actually got that line from Inarritu's film Birdman, starring Michael Keaton, a really great film. I don't know, I grew up and my dad was a football coach, and he wanted me to be a star football player, and I did well. I was a good football player, but there was a way in which that I knew I would get his love if I was a successful football player. I mean, I'm not really dissing my father. I mean, he loved me in other ways too, but I think I got it in my head that I had to be successful. I had to be athletic. I had to be smart. I had to be funny. To get people to like me, to get people to give me the praise I wanted. And over time, I think I really did start thinking, well, that's what love's like. So, if I'm married to someone, that person should just be like a really good audience member who thinks I'm funny and smart, and I'm going to entertain that person all the time. I'm being a little reductive just to give the example. But this has been a problem for me because, I mean, to me, affection, now I know at this age, I mean, requires rawness and vulnerability and messiness and stumbling and tripping and falling, and being in a relationship where you can do that and the relationship can contain that. I mean, that's really hard. That's hard work, as opposed to basically seeing yourself as a stand-up comic for your whole life, and confusing people's laughter for love for you when that's not really the case at all. So that's been one thing. That's one thing I hope I've learned. I mean, I've moved out of my marriage. I'm in a new relationship now, a serious relationship, And I'm really trying not to confuse admiration and affection this time around.
Yeah, it makes sense. And again, the whole motif of Godzilla, again, relates to that other Gnostic story, Frankenstein the monster, and all that. So yes, how we're cast into this world and energized with this false spirit, and we become these terrors, and sometimes we become the allies of mankind. So yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. Yeah, and one also section of Polaris Ghost, you talk about true detective. That's something I wanted to talk to you about, because I also contend, first season I'm talking about is a very Gnostic tale, very Manichaean, with Russ being the Gnostic misanthrope revealer and the Christ figure and all that. Do you agree with that, Eric?
I agree with that. I mean, I couldn't say any better than you. I mean, I think that show drew me in. I mean, it has one of the most horrifying depictions of evil I've ever seen. You know, of course, it involves children. It's just it's horrific. Yeah, and the Russ character, his ability to sort of span the cosmos, from he lost a child of his own, so he understands deeply the pain of losing children to death or to crime, and he gets that, and he's close to that, and he knows that the universe is a place where that can happen, and that gives him his sense of skepticism, almost nihilism, throughout much of the series. But it's precisely that which allows him to sort of understand the evil and allow him to uncover it and eradicate it. And that moment at the very end, when he comes out of the hospital and he talks about having seen his dead child, and he softens and cries. It's just lovely filmmaking. I think that, I mean, to me, that first season is kind of one of the best meditations on Gnosticism, along with Lynch, his Twin Peaks, that I've seen.
Right, and of course, the creator Nick Pizzolatto, I think he said he is influenced by Lynch, and the season 1 is basically Twin Peaks. It starts out with the death of the girl, detective, and then it goes into this sort of surreal spiritual world of this cosmic fight between good and evil.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, a dead woman, pale, like Laura was pale. Of course, you have this kind of weird ritual connected with the woman's death in True Detective. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It's a retelling of the first season of Twin Peaks.
And I have told people what I feel is some of the Gnostic literature out there. In your opinion, what are some other Gnostic books or Gnostic novels that you've read that you might want to share with the audience?
I'll have to think about this one for a minute.
Have you read Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian?
I have. Yeah, I think. I mean, yes. As
the judge is the demiurge.
The judge would be the demiurge. Yeah, I think that would definitely qualify as a Gnostic text. I mean, I can certainly go to maybe not obvious examples, but for me, Moby Dick is the consummate Gnostic text. Where you have. Ahab feels that the whale is a manifestation of all the evil in the world. He's a kind of Manichaean, and he believes that if he can kill the whale, he would sort of vanquish evil. But then you have Ishmael, who has a more kind of holistic Gnostic view, who ultimately maintains that the whole physical world is but a kind of pale copy of this ungraspable world beyond, and he's much more sort of flexible and open and playful. So to me, that Moby Dick kind of shows the two sides of Gnosticism. Right? On the one hand, you do have kind of straight up Manichaean Gnosticism, a kind of hard dualism. But then there's a more subtle kind of Gnosticism, like you see in Valentinus, where there's a sense that matter is not entirely fallen, that Sophia can still come down into the world of matter. And redeem people in the material world. So I like when I teach Moby Dick, I kind of work in that context. And even though Melville couldn't read the Nag Hammadi text like we can because they weren't available, he read a lot of the church fathers who were writing about the Gnostics as heretics, and just got enough of that, I think, to put it in his book. I have to say, Miguel, I don't know if there's this French guy named Jacques Le Carrier who wrote this tiny little book, I think in the 70s, simply called The Gnostics.
Oh, yeah, one of my favorites. Yeah,
beautiful little
philosophical.
book.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, I would take that over Hans Jonas and Elaine Pagels any day, because, I mean, it really gets to the lyrical heart of Gnosticism. And again, the more and more I like to think of Gnosticism not simply as a worldview, but as a way of expression, a way, a kind of aesthetics of Gnosticism. And to think about, well, how can we express ourselves in ways that kind of push against our traditional ways of understanding the world. William Blake knew all about this, right? William Blake came up with this idea called ratio. And we may have talked about this on an earlier show, but Blake says that most of us, so how many, say I see a robin, the bird, and when I'm a kid, like, oh my God, look at that robin. It's incredible. It's beautiful. It's weird. I've never seen one before. But when I'm 35, 40, 50 years old, I've seen like thousands of robins. So what I do is I create this kind of abstract image in my head, call it robinness. So then when I see a particular robin, I'm not really seeing that robin anymore. I'm just seeing my kind of abstraction of that robin. So Blake says most of us go through the world simply seeing it through these kind of abstractions that we've created in our minds from our past. So we're not really seeing the world at all. We're simply seeing our ideas of the world. And this is kind of the most pernicious curse of the demiurge, language
Yes.
and abstract thinking, right? Abstract thinking and language, which take us away from concrete experience. So Blake writes these really weird, challenging poems to kind of shut down our ability to abstract, to kind of shut down our ratio. He wants to give us the kind of raw isness, existence of the world.
Yeah, you speak about how language and abstract thought is demiurgic, Eric, and this reminds me right at your last book, Keep It Fake, how your father showed you this object and said ball. And this ball also became your ball and chain, because that led you to being an athlete and language and all that. So this stuff is powerful, like I said, destroying our children's souls.
Well, language, language, we have to have it. It's we don't have to have it, but it's obviously a powerful tool, and it creates poetry and fiction and myth and conversations like we're having. But there's always a danger that we confuse words with things, and we start taking the words that others have told to us more seriously than our own experience. So if my dad tells me, oh, this is what a ball means, and if I hold on to that meaning my whole life, then I'll never know what a ball means for myself. That's a rather banal example. But I think we're always, as thinkers, as seekers like we are, trying to have an experience of the world, as it is, which means outside of language, outside of words, which is obviously very hard to achieve. I mean, many people meditate their entire lives to try to have an experience outside of language. But I think that's what a lot of avant-garde painting and a lot of avant-garde literature tries to do. It tries to kind of shut down our meaning-making machines long enough to where we can kind of experience the world outside of the way we've made the world mean up until that point.
Well said, yes. And back to Gnostic writers, I'm assuming.
Yes.
You would mention two writers that were definitely influenced by Gnostics and knew about the Gnostics, and that would be Philip K. Dick and Jorge Luis Borges.
Oh, yes. Well, Philip K. Dick he's, as you and I both know, is not simply a writer influenced by Gnosticism. He was a Gnostic writer. I mean, exactly. I really feel like if a book like Valis, for instance, he's creating Gnostic myths in contemporary society, often with contemporary technology in mind. So I would say that he's, you can put him in the same list with Valentinus or
I agree.
I really think so. And Borges too. Borges is a little more subtle, philosophically speaking, but he's very much attuned again to this idea of that language itself is a kind of labyrinth. And if you're in the labyrinth, you're going to get lost. But if you can see the labyrinth from up above, it's often a beautifully geometrical shape, a mandala, and there's a feeling of wholeness. So I feel like that Borges is constantly moving us back and forth between being trapped in the prison house of language, only seeing the world through ratio, but occasionally through a work of art, we're elevated above that labyrinth and we see it as a kind of mandala, and we know where we are before we get dropped back in there again. By the way, Stanley Kubrick in The Shining has these lovely moments, right, about the maze, getting lost in the maze versus seeing the maze from up above. I think he's playing around with this. And of course, Carl Jung says that the best vision for the consciousness is the labyrinth, which can either be confusing or beautiful, depending on where you see it from.
Yes, and it was Philip K. Dick who said the labyrinth is always shifting. So these things were hit upon by these Gnostic-minded people as they're stuck in this house, this rickety house we call the universe, in our bathtubs, if we would.
Well, there's another. Speaking of rickety houses, there's a book that called The House of Leaves by Mark Danilewski, and it came out maybe 15 years ago or so. But it's about this house, and when it's when you're inside of it, it has one measurement, but when you're outside of it, it has another measurement. There's like this surplus somewhere in the house, and no one can find it. But ultimately, a character does find it, and it becomes a kind of portal. It becomes a kind of a descent into a kind of labyrinth. It's a very Gnostic book, very much in line with, say, Alice in Wonderland, which isn't about a child following so much through the portal of a house, is just through a kind of a portal under a tree. But I would definitely say Alice in Wonderland has a Gnostic feel. This young child is initiated in this world where traditional logic is constantly being undercut. And she learns something about herself that her mainstream Victorian society can't teach her.
And this all ties into, including your book, what we've said to blow by blow to Aronofsky's latest movie, Mother. Have you seen that?
I've not seen it yet.
Well, you need to. And we need to talk about it because it's a house. It's rickety. There's a demiurge. It's got all the themes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
All right.
The whole movie is inside this one house, which you find out is not really a house, if you know what I mean. I mean, you'll know this movie. You'll feel like you wrote this movie, Eric.
Okay.
You walk into it.
I'll go this weekend. It sounds great.
Yes. Definitely check it out, and we can talk about it in our next one. But I think that's all the time we have today. As I will mention in the introduction, this is the anniversary show, and I can't think of anybody better to really share it with or to be a guest, because your work has really influenced and inspired the show as it's inspired me. And I think the Gnostics throughout history have a great friend in Eric Wilson.
Well, thank you so much for saying that, Miguel. I mean, I feel the same about you and your work. I mean, we've talked together many times, and they've always been rich and inspiring conversations. And certainly this one is no different. And I look forward to future conversations about Gnosticism and all of its forms.
Agreed. I think we'll have a good time. What are you working on next?
Well, I'm actually working on a biography of a writer who is contemporary with William Blake, new William Blake. His name's Charles Lamb. He's now become a somewhat obscure essayist, but in his time was really important to people like Coleridge and Wordsworth. And also he saw his sister in a fit of madness kill her mother when he was only 20 years old, and took the knife away from her before she killed the father. So out of that, and he struggled with alcoholism and depression, but he wrote these really powerful essays about walking around London. The other thing I'm working on now is actually a podcast of my own.
All right,
it's only gonna be a 7-episode podcast, and it's called Belt, as in belt. Belt, a 2-man memoir. So myself and my friend Joel Tauber, who's in the art department here at Wake Forest, we're kind of exploring manhood, our experiences as men from birth to death. So the 7 episodes are kind of a try to capture the whole scope of a man's life, and through the stories, our own stories, as well as through the opinions of experts. So we have an episode called Hickory Stick, which is kind of explores discipline and parenthood. We have an episode called Raccoon, which explores men's relationship to animals. We have an episode called Uber, which explores men's relationships to machines. and each show is raw and vulnerable and profane and funny and witty. But we really hope to kind of, get at the complexities of being a thinking man, in our time, kind of pull between being sensitive and vulnerable, but also hearing these voices from more traditional fathers, who have told us what it means to be a man in a more traditional way. So it's very much in the Gnostic realm, for sure. So, more to come about that.
Oh, well, we look forward to that. I will certainly listen. Well, awesome. Glad to see you're sharing with the world these memories and ideas and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
So we can find out we're not replicants at the end of the day. Or maybe we are. Maybe we are. We'll just have to live with it. So what?
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, for coming on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, and really enjoyed your book, Polaris Ghost.
Thanks, Miguel. Take care. I look forward to talking again later on.